Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to present in front of this audience today. I'm presenting a paper which is joint work with Jan de Neve, and I'm going to show you a few figures that I think and hope can help solve one of the trickiest methodological issues in the use of life satisfaction data, that is the comparability of life satisfaction over time, one of the issues that Mark mentioned. So let me start from very back in time to what I believe is the first phrasing of life satisfaction question by Hadley Cantrell, who asked people to rate where they stand on a scale from 0 to 10 with their life. And this question and similar questions have been asked for over 60 years. Now we have good sense that the level of life satisfaction gives a good picture of the level of well-being in the society. But sometimes we don't want to measure levels. Rather, we want to measure changes. You can think in a policy situation, we want to know if a policy intervention makes it that people feel better or worse. Now, typically, what we do is that we ask the same person or the same population at 2 points in time how satisfied they are, and then we calculate the difference between the two, and we infer if they feel better. But you don't need to be a well-being scientist to see that there might be an important problem, which is one of scale shifts. We are not sure that the same person is using the scale in the same way. So what can we do to infer if people are feeling better? And here it comes, are feeling better or feeling worse. And some help can come again from Hadley Cantrell. So the Cantrell letter was the very first question in the Hadley Cantrell survey. The second question is the following: where on the letter would you say you stood 5 years ago? So we then have available two original ratings, which are the life satisfaction and the retrospective level of satisfaction. And if we compare the two, we can have an interpersonal measure of change, which is perceived change. So this is a little bit different from what we usually look at. Usually it's observed changes, so we look at changes in feelings. Here we're looking at feelings about the change. If I'm asking Casper how satisfied he is, and he's rating his life better than 5 years ago, in some genuine sense, he's probably feeling better about his life. Now, what I'll do here is that I'm gonna play with this measure and look at what it can tell us about changes over time, and in particular, over the life course. So what's the relationship between perceived changes as a function of age? Where do we start from? So what we know is that life satisfaction over the life cycle is mostly stable, but with a ditch in the 40s and a peak in the 60s, and this seemed to be quite a robust finding around the world and in different epochs. We also know some things about perceived changes and age, namely that people tend to, on average, rate their current life as higher than past life, and they expect their life to go higher. You can already see this in the data from Cantrell. And thanks to the work of some psychologists, we also know that age seems to matter. So on average, youngsters tend to report perceived changes which are higher than older people. So what I'm gonna show you is I'm gonna look what is the pattern of perceived changes over the life cycle. Is it stable in different countries, in different epochs, and what can we learn from it in terms of socioeconomic factors? And it's quite a large project where we used a lot of data, but what I'm presenting you today comes from the first 3 datasets, which all ask life satisfaction on the country ladder and retrospective satisfaction 5 years ago on the country ladder. Okay, let me start with the USA, simply because the country where we have a lot of data about satisfaction and retrospective satisfaction. So this is probably the key graph of the presentation. So the dots here are the average perceived change conditional on age. That is to say, this dot tells you that a person in the 20 on average rate their current satisfaction as 1 point higher than 5 years ago. And a person who's 80 rate her life satisfaction to be half a point lower than 5 years ago. Now, this is a quadratic figure, so it could take different shapes, but it seems to me quite a linear decline over time, which switches sign in the 60s. That is to say, people feel that they're doing better than in the past up to the 60s, and then it reverts. But this is conditional on nothing, so these are just raw data. What we can also do is to run a regression on observable characteristics, quite a standard set, and then plot the residuals as a function of age. And the pattern is quite similar. So you have this declining line. The main change is that the switching point is earlier, is around the 40s. So this is data from the US, but it's cross-sectional data. So, and it's in a particular country, in a particular epoch. What can we extend this stylized effect? So what I did is that we looked around the world using Gallup World Poll data, and it turns out that this decline of perceived changes with age is quite a stable pattern around the world from 25 on in quite wealthy countries, but also in all world regions, basically. And as I said, this is cross-sectional data, so here we're interviewing people who are from different birth cohorts, from a different epoch. Can this be an explanation of the of this declining pattern? So what we did next is to look at this pattern with data back from the 50s. And this was made possible thanks to the original data collected by Cantrell. So if you look at the pattern in the US today and you compare it to the pattern that we observed in the 50s, they're actually quite similar. So it doesn't seem to be a cohort effect. You actually have this negative relationship between perceived changes and age already back in time. And we can look at also in other countries. There are different countries in Cantrell's data set. This is a quite stable pattern. So at this point, hopefully I convinced you, going pretty fast on this slide, I convinced you that there is a quasi-linear trend in perceived changes that decline with age. But don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that perceived life satisfaction diminishes with age, because perceived changes measure marginal rates. So what we can use is that we can reconstruct the perceived life trajectory by looking at perceived changes. We start from an arbitrary 0 point, and then we look at perceived changes over time. So how does the life satisfaction trajectory looks like? It looks something like this. So it's a positive increase up to the 40s, and then a plateau up to the late 60s, and then start declining. And this is a quite different picture from the one that we obtained by looking at the levels of life satisfaction, which is more something like this. So more variation around a baseline. There are also some commonalities. I think an important one is that the ditch in the 40s corresponds to the change in the convexity of the perceived trajectory. And the highest point in both cases is around the 60s. Now, if we accept that this measure traces the changes in well-being well, what can we learn from this? And I would like to bring you the example of the relationship between life satisfaction and income, which is quite a long debated relationship where we know that there are two paradoxes. So the first one is that over the life cycle, life satisfaction tends to be quite stable, quite flat, and doesn't raise with income, but at a point in time in a society, richer people are more satisfied with their life. And this extends to the country level. At a certain point in time, richer countries are more satisfied, but as the GDP per capita increases, we don't observe an increase in life satisfaction. These are figures from Richard Easterlin. So what you see is that the life satisfaction is quite a flat line, while personal income increases over time, and the same at the country level. So if you look at the US, happiness is quite stable, while GDP per capita just increases. Now, what about perceived life satisfaction trajectories? I showed you that life satisfaction trajectory is an increasing concave curve, and this is actually more or less the pattern of income over the life cycle. That is to say, so this dotted lines is the average income per age in the US in 2019. If we look at the country level instead of the personal level, so the variation over time that we're looking at is not from age to different age, but from a macroeconomic perspective, the dotted line is the GDP per capita, which is an increasing line, and the subjective life satisfaction trajectory that we can construct only for the US, because it's the only country where we have the data, looks as well as an increasing trajectory. Now, of course, they're correlated because there are two increasing trajectories, but I think that it's most interesting to look at the other temporal bits that we can analyze from 1995 to 2010, where you see that there are two recessions in 2010 and 2008, and this corresponds to two ditches in the subjective life satisfaction trajectory. I showed you a lot of figures, mostly to give food for the discussion, so let me just wrap up at this point by saying that perceived changes linearly decrease over the life course, and this seems to be a robust fact around countries and in different epochs, and that the perceived trajectory of life satisfaction, so constructed based on these perceived changes, follows a concave increasing pattern. And hopefully this can help conciliate some of the paradoxes and problems that we have with the predictions of economic theory with respect to life satisfaction data. I close with a puzzle. There is also a puzzle, which is if we look at, in particular, longitudinal data, the observed year-to-year change tend to be negative, while the perceived year-to-year change tend to be positive. That is to say, if we use observed changes or perceived changes, the two patterns over the life course are quite different. And I don't have a solution to it, but I'm very happy to hear your suggestions. So thank you for your attention.